we all know that travel at the moment is interesting. Anyone who's been through an airport recently will no doubt have a story to tell. But if we get beyond the immediacy and what's happening in front of us at the moment, and I'm sure what's happening is putting some people off traveling at least. We know that in the last 6 months or so, as lockdowns have been kind of scaled back and testing requirements reduced, there's been a rebound in travel, and it's people going on their holidays, but we also know it's business travel. The conferences are back, the meetings are coming back. But it's a really important time for professional service firms to reflect on what that future of travel in their business might look like, and beyond kind of does anybody want to go through an airport? Of course, we've got really two big questions that should be driving those conversations. And one is a very kind of hard-nosed financial question. We know that travel costs a lot of money. And we know, of course, during the lockdown, when suddenly everybody went from being hypermobile to sitting at home, expenditure dropped rapidly, and that was one of the things, of course, that maintained liquidity for many firms was a drop off in expenditure on travel and related expenses. And of course, that's beneficial for profit, but also in terms of clients and delivering an efficient and effective service for clients. So there's a financial driver to think about this, but of course, more widely, and I think we'll hear more about related topics from our other speakers, there's of course an environmental, a carbon, climate, sustainability question about travel as well. This was very present before COVID. It's still very present now. And thinking about the travel as one of often the major sources of carbon beyond the offices, really, which of course are half empty now. For organizations thinking how they manage their carbon emissions and how travel generates that is also really important. So we've got some crucial drivers. We could think of others as well about employee well-being. Whilst travel often seems glamorous, for those who are hypermobile, often it is much less glamorous and often quite stressful. So there are many drivers. What I want to kind of put on the table, I suppose, this morning is three considerations. So as Richard alluded to, we were, as COVID struck, we were in the middle of a piece of research looking at travel in professional services, and we'd surveyed 2,000 plus employees in a range of multinational organizations, looking at their travel patterns, the reasons for travel, what they were doing when they were traveling, and also how they anticipated things potentially changing in the future. Of course, we hadn't quite anticipated a pandemic at the point of doing that work. But we learned quite a lot from that, and it leads me to these kind of three propositions that I want to put on the table. And the first one is that often when we think about travel and we try to manage it in professional service firms, we ignore the fact that actually travel is has multiple forms and it is multiple different practices. So actually what people are doing when they travel and why they travel, there are multiple stories to understand. We often associate it with a meeting. It's the most common thing that comes to mind. But actually what we found was across different professional service sectors, there are a whole range of different reasons for travel that mean that when we try to manage the future of travel, and whether we're trying to reduce travel or whether we're trying to simply minimize its impacts, we have to recognize these variety of different roles. So yes, there are meetings, yes, there are conferences, but there are what we called in-person tasks, auditors going out to assess stock levels, all kinds of range of different things that require travel that go beyond the kind of obvious. And that's kind of banal in some ways, but it's important to recognize that, because that's the first step in thinking about how we manage travel, because we can't manage it as a singular phenomena. We need to understand why people are traveling and think about the different responses, because some kinds of travel are perhaps more amenable to being reduced and being managed than others. We know that some travel is important and some things we wouldn't want to stop. So understanding why your people are traveling, what they're doing, is really the first step in the story. The second thing that I would put on the table is that as part of an attempt to manage travel effectively, it's really important that we don't become what I would call technologically determinist. So this is, we don't become obsessed with Zoom and Teams. So clearly we've had the greatest Zoom and Teams experiment ever over the last 2 years, and we've moved forward exponentially in terms of the ability to do things digitally compared with where we were 2 years ago. And that's all very important. But actually, when we were doing our research, we were finding that travelers were telling us the need to travel was partly associated with the limits of what they could do digitally, but actually was as much associated with how work was organized within the organization. So how managers, those organizing work within the firm were making decisions about how to deliver that work. So how to constitute teams, how to manage client relationships, decisions that were being made that were outside of the control of the people that were traveling in many cases. And they were saying that if the organization rethought how it conducted its work, that could have as bigger impact on the need to travel as any technological development. So the second thing really is to think about what the firm can do to reflect on how it organizes itself, how it potentially creates demand for travel because of the way it does things. And we're going to hear more about learning and development later. And this was one of the key areas that was highlighted about how much learning and development required travel in many of these multinational organizations. And there can be good reasons for that because there are real benefits of getting people together. But real questions emerging about whether that should always be travel driven or whether there are other ways of delivering learning and development. So my third thing, my third kind of proposition on the table would be that travel is actually in some ways is a decision, but it's a decision that's made by multiple parties. We often associate travel management with people making better decisions, but we often assume it's the traveller that needs to make a better decision. They need to choose not to travel, or they need to choose to go on the train rather than to fly. And there's some truth in that, but actually the decisions are quite dispersed across the organisation. Again, we asked travellers how much control they had, who was making decisions, and the results showed that in many cases there was other people rather than the traveller themselves that were actually creating the need for travel. And this takes us back to that point about organisations kind of reflecting on how they drive the need for travel. So we're in a particular moment as we come out of COVID. Travel is coming back. Everybody wants to see people they've not seen for years. Really what we need to think about is what the 2-3 year kind of trajectory for this is, and how now's a chance to kind of start to have these reflections and to start to manage things perhaps in a slightly different way if those financial and environmental pressures are going to be taken seriously.